Welcome to the Hedgehog Noon Discussion. I'm Jay Tolson, editor of the Hedgehog Review and a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture at the University of Virginia. We're delighted today to have one of our contributing editors and a truly regular contributing editor to the Hedgehog Review, Richard Hughes Gibson, professor of English, associate professor of English at Wheaton College, but a truly Renaissance man in his approaches to learning, to knowledge, his investigations of virtually every topic bring a broad humanistic reach. I say truly Renaissance man because this is not rarefied, arcane pursuit of pure knowledge. He makes contact with the physical world, the world of our technologies, as is reflected in the many things that he's written. His books include Forgiveness in Victorian Literature, Charitable Writing, Paper Electronic Literature, an Archaeology of Born Digital Materials, and soon to be in print, The Way of Dante. Just the breadth of those topics should give you some idea of his range. Today, he is going to address a topic that many might consider far too addressed in other fora. But for us, I think we're particularly glad to have Rick talk about this topic because he brings, as I say, such an interesting perspective. He elucidates clearly, but he also gives one a rich awareness of the background in media developments. Rick is going to be using slides today, and this will be largely his presentation, but we hope to bring in some questions from the audience toward the end. So, Rick, thank you again for appearing today, and we look forward to the presentation.
Well, thanks, Jay. What a generous introduction. I'm grateful for the Hedgehog readership and the Hedgehog editors who take rather tawdry things I send to them, brush them up, and present them to the world in really glistening form. So thank you. My presentation today will last for about 45 minutes. It's a larger presentation that brings together materials that I've been assembling over the course of the year while leading a faculty seminar on AI in the liberal arts. And I think you'll feel that flavoring as we go. The goal of the presentation is, I'm getting sorry, did you hear that? Yeah, good. The goal of the presentation is to help you to understand what's happening right now, but I'm trying to frame it on both ends by larger considerations about the conversation that's going on about AI. As I said, I'll speak for about 45 minutes, and then after that point, I'll be happy to entertain questions. Those of you who have to leave for meetings or whatnot after that, don't feel bad about departing early. Okay, here we go. Okay, we see the screen. Kyle, I need a nod.
Yeah, I can see it fine. Go ahead.
Okay. So thanks to Leanne for making this really awesome graphic. I've borrowed the imagery throughout the presentation from that. All right, so I want to start with some preliminary considerations about how we imagine AI and how we talk about AI, because my presentation will be challenging a couple of those presumptions, I think, and part of our larger cultural imagination at this time. All right, so let's start with the iconography of AI. I asked Gemini to make me a picture of AI, and this is what it came up with. And in this respect, I think Gemini really is truly echoing the picture of AI that's in most people's heads that's a result of science fiction in the later 20th century. Right? We imagine AI as a humanoid robot that continues to have a nose and lips for no apparent reason. And in this case, is holding up a hologram that it's basically using as an iPad, totally unnecessarily because it's a computer on the inside. Or take this one. This is a kind of William Gibson inspired graphic that ChatGPT actually explains. It's giving us a humanoid robot with a head with a glowing network inside of it. That's not, for the most part, what I want to talk about today. When I'm talking about AI, I'm looking at this. This is the cover of the November 2024 National Geographic issue on AI. And I think it's really excellent at reminding us that what's behind the products we're interacting with now are actually servers. Lots and lots of servers. And when we think about AI, we need to think about it not as one robot standing in front of us, but in fact, a variety of servers interacting with each other, and thereby, hold on one second, I'm going to change this so that I can, getting all the pop-up messages. So that, so we think about it not as like a single robotic interface. Hold on, I need to stop sharing for just 1 second, Cobb. Okay. So we think about it not as a single robotic interface, but actually as a diffuse network that's processing multiple parties' requests all at the same time. And not as a single identity, but actually as a variety of latent powers and potential personas. All right, and now how about the terminology of AI? So I'm going to use 3 terms today, largely the first one, and I just want to make sure that everybody's on the same page. So let's start with artificial general intelligence. Artificial general intelligence is a term that's held up in opposition to artificial narrow intelligence. So when we're using ChatGPT to generate sentences for us, that's narrow intelligence. But in the development of large language models, there's been all these emergent capabilities that have come about. And as a result of that, computer scientists have gotten really excited about the possibility of one tool expanding into a kind of Swiss Army knife. And then, as we're going to see in today's presentation, researchers at different kind of larger big tech operations have realized that they can cobble together systems, one, say, for computer vision, another one for text generation, and then the result is something that behaves unlike any kind of computer interface that we've previously had. So as a result of that, computer scientists have started to debate what should even count as general intelligence. And this is a point that I think cannot be stressed enough, that computer scientists are actually now entering a field that previously would have been the domain of psychologists and philosophers. Like, what even is intelligence? Well, as they're developing their products and then developing benchmarks for their products, they are starting to tell us what intelligence is. So this paper that came out in 2023 has had a big impact. It was written by a woman named Meredith Morris and her team at DeepMind, right? So that's one of the creators of these products. And they argue, their most important argument is that we should think about general intelligence in terms of capabilities, not processes. So it doesn't matter what's happening under the hood. What really matters is what it can do. And then this graphic, which you can look at in one of the links that Kyle's going to be sharing, shows you their attempt, based on their definition, to define where we are in the development of artificial general intelligence. The lesson here is well distilled in an article that I actually largely disagree with by a philosopher named Tobias Rees, which is that the big tech companies have become accidental philosophical laboratories. So as they're developing their products and they're trying to explain what their products do, they are now behaving as philosophers because they're having to explain, well, what is intelligence and what are the differences between this domain of human experience and this other domain? And I also really like these words from Nigel Shadbolt, who's a computer science, like a really eminent computer scientist in Britain, in which he just reminds us that intelligence actually is something that's quite difficult to enumerate in just a few like bullet points. Right? It's really a diffuse concept. And so we should not so easily hand this over to computer scientists to explain back to us as they try to sell us things. Okay. Another term that has become very important in the last couple of years is multimodality. And it means kind of what you think it means, which is that humans have lots of senses, and our senses work together to create a composite experience of reality. So now one of the goals of artificial intelligence development is to represent those modalities and then to get them to interact. The graphic that you see here is from a product called Molmo, released by the Allen Institute for free. Feel free to go and play with it. Unfortunately, I think Molmo is pretty much doomed. Other things do what it does better than it, but it's worth just playing with for a few minutes. And you'll see the examples that I've tiled here. You can show it a picture of records and then ask what kind of music this is. You can give it a prompt and then say, make me a picture of this. So it's able to move back and forth between the visual world and the textual world. And then just very quickly, I don't think this really needs to be belabored. What is superhuman intelligence? Well, people are debating this too. In the Levels of AGI paper, Morris and her team define it again in terms of narrow and general. Right, so narrow superhuman or superhuman intelligence or superintelligence is the ability to do something better than any human expert can. And they use the example of AlphaFold, the study of protein folding that recently won the co-founder of DeepMind a Nobel Prize. And then superintelligence or superhuman intelligence would be the ability to do all things or many things, or generally, so-called ASI, generally exceeding any human expert's ability. And then you can see here, I gave you a second definition just for the sake of consultation. You can go back after the presentation if you're interested in this slide. All right, now, because this is an academic presentation, I have to cite myself. And I just want to remind you of the first sentence of my language machinery piece from now 2.5 years ago, which is that general intelligence is a headspace and a technology. As much an event playing out in our minds as it is a material reality emerging at our fingertips, right? That there's all of these things, there's a kind of cultural event or social event that's taking place around AI and around questions of definition, around questions of how we imagine AI that seem to me just as important as the actual tools. And often our imaginations run many steps ahead of what the tools are doing and where the developers actually are. And my view is the developers are actively encouraging that, right? That they're overselling what it is that they've already achieved. Okay, so the heart of today's presentation is an attempt to distill what's been happening over the last 1.5 years or so that's been in the news. And I think some of the news discussion is a little bit misleading, and some of it's also just frankly impenetrable. So I want to tell you a story that ends with DeepSeek. Okay, in brief, my story goes like this. We're going to move from model scaling being the goal of large language development and some other related kind of processes in generative artificial intelligence. And then we're going to move to inference scaling, which was the kind of major project of late 2023 and much of 2024. And then we're going to talk a little bit about DeepSeek and cost cutting. And I'm really hoping that when I'm done with these slides, you'll feel better equipped to read the news and to understand why it is that people are so excited about DeepSeek or depressed by it. Okay, so we need to start by just understanding what's going on with a large language model. And I really, really like this article from Will Douglas Heaven that ran in the MIT Tech Review a couple weeks ago that's about DeepSeek. And he starts with a really nice discussion of what is involved with creating a large language model, right? So as Heaven points out, it's fun to say his name, right? As Heaven points out, there's 2 stages in large language model training. The first is known as pre-training. Most of us know about that phase. That's the phase where the company takes a scrape of the internet that's been cleaned up, and don't believe the news, it's not the entire internet. You do not want to put the entire internet as is into your large language model. It would be the most abusive, icky thing you could possibly imagine. So the internet is scraped, lots of text and images pulled off of it, it's cleaned up, and then it's converted into a form that computers can understand because computers actually can't use words. They can simulate words, so it's these parts of words are turned into tokens, basically like giving it an ID number, and then those words are analyzed so that you can create this thing called word embeddings. And so kind of like a network description of words relationships, like graphs and vectoring. That's another presentation that usually takes about half an hour for me to explain. Anyway, so we got the model that's built. Then there's more things that have to be done, because after you've built the model, all the model can usually do is produce the next word in a Word document. So we needed to do other things. And what happens next is called fine-tuning. And as Heaven points out in this piece, the fine-tuning stage has a lot of, and I would like underline this word or this phrase if you're taking notes, hidden human labor. Tons of hidden human labor. Humans have to interact with the model to train it and thereby adjust all the weights within the model to do things that are useful other than predicting the next word in a Word document, right? So it's a kind of almost a kind of ambidextrous quality, right? It's the ability of a large language model to do this thing and this other thing, to be able to play in so many domains is really the result of the fine-tuning phase, which is governed by humans. And up till the end of last year, the best company at doing the reinforcement phase was OpenAI. Now, there's a really great blog and newsletter that I recommend to all of you. There's a book that came out by these guys last year called the AI Snake Oil Newsletter. And it's not quite what you see. This is a Princeton computer scientist and one of his PhD candidates. And they have a really nice summary of the status quo prior to the end of last year, right? That after the release of GPT-4 in March 2024, the dominant narrative in the tech world was that continued scaling of models, just making them bigger and bigger and bigger, would lead to artificial general intelligence and then superintelligence. Now, why is that? Well, if you had been following the development of large language models, as I have been since 2019, like really closely, you'd have seen the development of each iteration, right? The next step of the model, as the models took in more and more words, had more and more parameters, they had a greater ability to analyze the language, and they consume more and more money, compute, right, or computing power and time at data centers, their performance improved by leaps and bounds. It really was remarkable. The movement from GPT-1 to GPT-2 was revelatory. The movement from GPT-2 to GPT-3, especially GPT 3.5, was remarkable. And then GPT-4 was doing things that none of the computer scientists had imagined possible. So this is a paper that came out in 2023 that got some news called Sparks of AI. And this was done by a group at Microsoft Research. And in the piece, here's what they say. Look, GPT-4 can code, and it can do really hard kinds of coding. And it seems to know a lot of languages that we didn't teach it. It can look at a data visualization and explain what's going on in the chart. You can ask it to design a pretty simple video game for you in HTML. You can reverse engineer assembly code. Not that many people can do that. It can plan how to hack a computer. So it actually writes a detailed plan about how you could hack into a computer. At one point, it has recommendations about how to write a graphic novel for girls. It provides instructions for managing a zoo through command line instructions. It passed a bunch of theory of mind tests where you would give GPT-4 a story and then ask GPT-4 about how the people in the story were feeling. And it answered well. It could pick up on the kind of cues in the language. And then as you'll see at the bottom, it also asked it to write a proof of the fact that there are infinitely many primes in the style of a Shakespeare play through dialogue between parties arguing over the proof. So computer scientists looked at GPT-4 and they said, wow, each time we make the model bigger, it can do more and more things. So unsurprisingly, their assumption was, well, let's just keep making the models bigger. Oh, and this is the last thing. They asked it to make unicorns using this thing called LaTeX, which is a way of a kind of text writing system that scientists use for presenting their papers. Okay, so I could show this a bunch of different ways, but look at the graphic that you see on the left side of the screen. So we could think about this in terms of words, right? We could go back to the turn of our current century And we could say, back then, people were really excited because the internet would give you millions of words. And if you're a computer scientist who is interested in doing anything related to language, you could just start stealing words off the internet. And then we could keep plugging along and just keep adding words to our language model. And that would be a way to display it. So there's different ways to show this. I could also talk about the amount of time that a data center would be crunching numbers, but I thought this graphic from the Wall Street Journal was pretty good because it shows you the size of GPT-1 in terms of parameters. Those are adjustable weights. Some people have talked about them as like levers that are happening within the system as you're starting to define the relationships between parts of words. Right? So initially we have 117 million, right? Then we have 1.5 billion. Then we have 175 billion. Then in GPT-4's case, we have 1.76 trillion. Right, so the assumption was, let's just keep making the models bigger and bigger. But the problem began actually in 2023 as OpenAI tried to transition from GPT-4 to building GPT-5. Now, this is one of the articles that you absolutely must read after this presentation. It's called The Next Great Leap in AI, ran in the Wall Street Journal in December. And what the article talks about is the fact that OpenAI researchers ran into a bunch of problems that are indicative of the crisis in model scaling itself. One was there just weren't enough good words. There wasn't enough new stuff to add into the model to improve its performance. So what they did was they hired humans. They hired scientists and mathematicians to write problems and explain how to solve them. And then they fed that back into GPT-5, which at this point was called Orion, in order to improve its performance. They gave it months of time, which meant burning a tremendous amount of power. And its performance really wasn't what they expected it to be. It wasn't getting that much better than GPT-4. So the crisis with model scaling was happening on multiple fronts. So the people within OpenAI and the people who are watching OpenAI closely realized we've got to pivot and try to do something else. And the solution was to turn to inference. Okay, so here, this is a really nice summary from the AI Snake Oil newsletter. Then came 3 back-to-back reports revealing that the AI developers, OpenAI, Anthropic, and Google Gemini, had all run into the same problem with their next generation model, right? And then basically, the people who had been saying all we need to do is build larger and larger models, like insiders at OpenAI said, you know what, now we're entering a new era. So there was a kind of embarrassed moment in which even the people inside these companies decided that they had to try to do something else. And what they pivoted to doing was called inference scaling. And what inference scaling is about giving the system more time to decide on its answer. So rather than front loading the process and just trying to build a kind of mega model, now let's think a little bit more about what happens when words start coming out of the system on the other side. So this is an extremely deceptive graphic. I have showed it twice and both times regretted it. So this is my warning, right? This is not a reliable graphic. It is questionable, unclear, uncertain, unsettled, precarious, dubious, unsteady, indecisive, and problematic. Okay, so let's go back to it with that proviso. Okay, so the old model, before OpenAI debuted its Strawberry, or what's now called O1, these so-called chain of thought or reasoning models, was that you expend a tremendous amount of effort in pre-training, then post-training, that's that fine-tuning phase, and then the actual kind of cost of producing what comes out, which tends to be one word or token, it's just emitted after you ask it to do all these things, is relatively small. The shift that took place over the last year and a half was towards spending much more compute, giving more power and time to the model to decide what the answer should be before it comes up with a final solution that offers to the user. Okay, so we can see that there's this changeover from saying it's all about pre-training, it's all about making the model bigger and bigger, to saying, you know what, like, what's the answer? Like, how is it coming up with the answer? And how can we use the model to get better answers? Here's an example from a paper from 2022 that was starting to lead in this direction. And I'm just going to explain what you're seeing. So on the left side of the screen, you're seeing what would happen if you just gave us an example. All of the input is what was shown to ChatGPT. So we have a question and an answer that's given as a model, and then a question, and then the model's trying to come up with the answer, and the model gets it wrong when it's just giving back that kind of answer. Okay, so if it says, okay, here's a question, here's an answer, here's a question, then in the way that ChatGPT or any large language model would analyze this, it would realize that the response needs to begin answer and then provide the answer. So then this team said, what if we actually showed it how to answer the first question? So what you're seeing in the second case is an example that's added in that shows the model, here's how you could answer the first question. And then what they found was simply by feeding back in examples that had like procedures for answering the questions built in, the performance dramatically improved. Okay, so now we're starting to demonstrate chains of thought to the models, and then we're going to ask the models to spend more time explaining their answers on the other end. So if you just look at the two sides, this is the key point I'm trying to make. In the first case, we get 3 words and a number. In the second case, we get an explanation that leads to the answer. So in terms of this extremely misleading graphic, there's a lot more words in the inference or output section, right? Because we're showing it's showing its work in a certain way. All right, now this can then be expanded out into various other procedures where perhaps the model can come up with multiple answers and then rank the answers before offering them back to the user. And this truly is my favorite phrase that I have come across in the last year from a paper by Brown et al., who's a bunch of academics with one person from DeepMind mixed in, large language monkeys, right? Like the monkey problem, right? Like giving a bunch of monkeys typewriters to produce Shakespeare. Their argument is, let's give the model the ability to be a bunch of monkeys, and then we'll rank the responses. And then the ranking system will choose from among the responses to give the best response to the user. And then if you look at the bottom of the slide, you'll see what they discovered, and a bunch of researchers discovered around the same time, was it turns out that you didn't have to have the biggest model to get the best answers. Right? So now we don't need to make enormous exploding models with trillions and trillions of parameters. It could be the smaller model with more thinking time will actually function just as well for chain of thought or reasoning tasks. So a smaller model might not be as good at answering certain kinds of historical questions or doing creative writing, but for thinking and reasoning, it might be just as good. And that means that now the cost can go way down. And that brings us to DeepSeek. This is back to Heaven's piece. When the Chinese firm DeepSeek dropped a large language model called R1 last week, it sent shockwaves through the US tech industry. Not only did R1 match the best of the homegrown competition, it was built for a fraction of the cost and given away for free. It was open source. DeepSeek replaces supervised fine-tuning, where an RLHF, or human reinforcement, with reinforcement learning that is fully automated, right? So it's using its own verifiers, and it's also doing a bunch of other techniques like this thing called mixture of experts, and it's using former iterations of its own model as a way of training itself. Instead of using human feedback to steer its models, the firm uses feedback scores produced by a computer. The downside to this approach is that computers are good at scoring answers about math and code, but not very good at scoring answers to open-ended or more subjective questions. To train its models to answer a wider range of non-math questions or perform creative tasks, DeepSeek still has to ask people to provide the feedback. But even that is cheaper in China, right? So there's still a certain kind of hidden human labor that at least the members of the general public often don't realize is there. But part of the way that DeepSeek has been cutting costs is A, it's cutting humans out of the fine-tuning phase, or at least parts of the fine-tuning phases, right? And having the computer do it. It's using a smaller model, and then it's using cheaper human labor that's available in China. So the move now in this year seems to be towards these cost-cutting measures that then mean you can give the product away for free, and then there's a different kind of business model that grows out of that. Okay. All right, now we've got kind of the lay of the land. Let's talk about AI agents. AI agents are directly tied to the turn towards inference scaling. Once you can create a large language model that can reason, or at least appear to reason, that can hold a chain of thought and can entertain multiple options or multiple strategies, now you can build these agents we've been hearing about, including Agent Force, which came up, I noticed, in a Super Bowl commercial. Okay, so here's a really nice example. This is also from the tech review. I also put a link to this in the file that Kyle shared. In December, Google DeepMind revealed an experimental new web browsing agent called Mariner. In the middle of a preview demo that the company gave to MIT Technology Review, Mariner seemed to get stuck. Mega Goal, a product manager at the company, had asked the agent to find her a recipe for Christmas cookies that looked like ones in a photo she'd given it. Mariner found a recipe on the web and started adding the ingredients to Goal's online grocery basket. Then it stalled. It couldn't figure out what type of flour to pick. Goal watched as Mariner explained its steps in a chat window. It says, "I will use the browser's back button to return to the recipe." It was a remarkable moment. Instead of hitting a wall, the agent had broken the task down into separate actions and picked one that might resolve the problem. Figuring out you need to click the back button may sound basic, but for a mindless bot, it's akin to rocket science. And it worked. Mariner went back to the recipe, confirmed the type of flour, and carried on filling Goal's basket. Right? So you have to have the inference scaling or the shift towards chain of thought or reasoning in order to have something like Mariner do its thing. It has to be able to say, I'm not just going to produce the next word over and over and over again, more and more exactly with a bigger and bigger understanding of the relationship between words. I have to know that there's multiple options, and I have to be able to move between them. Okay, so this is OpenAI's agent that just debuted. It's called Operator. And this is a picture that I just took off of their own blog where they were advertising it. And you can see from the center panel of the slide, the user has typed, "Find and book me the highest rated one-day tour of Rome on TripAdvisor." And then the bot responds, "I'll search for the highest rated tour of historic Rome." And then it works for 2 minutes, and then it brings up this website. Okay, here's what they say about it. Operator can be asked to handle a wide variety of repetitive browser tasks, such as filling out forms, ordering groceries, and even creating memes. The ability to use the same interfaces and tools that humans interact with on a daily basis broadens the utility of AI, helping people save time on everyday tasks while opening up new engagement opportunities for businesses. And that, in my own view, this is the fulfillment of the dream that was launched with Siri and Alexa a few years ago, in which you can hand off domestic chores to the bot, and then the bot will go and do them for you. Early product reviews are mixed. But for our purposes right now, what I want to stress is, well, how does it work? Their explanation should make sense in light of what I've been saying. Here's what they say on the blog. Operator is powered by a new model called Computer Using Agent, combining GPT-4o's vision capabilities with advanced reasoning through reinforcement learning. CUA is trained to interact with graphical user interfaces, right? So the stuff you see when you open up your computer, all the pictures, the buttons, menus, and text fields that people see on a screen. So this is the realization of the project of multimodality, right? It can move between seeing a picture of your desktop and then having a chain of reasoning conversation with itself about what to do next. Operator can see, I do like the quotes, through screenshots and interact using all the actions a mouse and keyboard allow with a browser, enabling it to take action on the web without requiring custom API integrations. And then they admit that it sometimes runs into trouble, right? Like Goal and the Christmas cookie recipe, and sometimes it can't get out. If it encounters challenges or makes mistakes, Operator can leverage its reasoning capabilities to self-correct. When it gets stuck and needs assistance, it simply hands control back to the user, ensuring a smooth and collaborative experience. Now, of course, it's not going to be so smooth. This is OpenAI's description of how it should work, but that's the idea. This is the kind of, we're going to take those chain of reasoning models, we're going to take multimodality, and now we're going to make a product that you can just tell what you want it to do, and it will go off and do it for you. All right. A little bit more framing comes from a guy named Reese Rogers, who writes for Wired, a nifty piece. I'm going to quote some from it later. And Reese comes up with some categories that the people in my seminar have found really useful, and I want to offer them to you, right? So from the user side, what are these agents? Well, Rogers says there are two things. They're extending the project of having computers feed us, and they're extending the project of having computers represent us. These are already goals that are expressed in the way we use computers, but they're taking them to sort of new lengths. So first he says, feeding agents are algorithms with data about your habits and tastes that search through swaths of information to find what's relevant for you, right? Like once upon a time when you were using Facebook years ago, before it was totally toxic, right? You might say like, it might recommend to you, or when Amazon recommends a book to you, right? A book or an article, that kind of thing. Sounds familiar, right? Any social media recommendation engine filling out a timeline with tailored posts or incessant ad tracker showing me those mushroom gummies for the 1,000th time on Instagram should be considered a personal agent, right? So we got feeders. They're going to go out and get things for us based on profiles of our preferences. Okay, then there's the representatives. As for AI agents that represent you, they are also mere algorithms, but these are designed to learn your behavior and mimic it, acting on your behalf during online interactions. It's the fantasy of a digital twin. The language of clone is actually often used, that can attend video meetings for you, write thank you notes to your wedding gifts, and call a restaurant to reserve you a table. This also includes generative AI tools made to impersonate famous people, to auto interact with their fans, right? So on the user side, the attraction, or maybe but we'll actually find off-putting, would be feeding and representing. On the company side, the attraction is having agents that can do things that computers have previously been doing faster, and then take on responsibilities that are now handed off to humans, right? So they can gather data from sources and custom interactions and transaction histories. They can make decisions. They can execute actions, and they can learn and adapt from situations. And then the argument that Salesforce makes about the product is it's going to free up human agents. But if you look closely at the products, it looks like they're going to replace humans. I didn't have time to include this, but there's a video that they put up on YouTube that's an example of how Agentforce would work, and I highly recommend that you watch it. I will add that to the file after this presentation is done. And what they're showing you is a client writing to a company asking about like an order for something, and then interacting with the bot. And when the commentator pauses, the commentator explains that this is a shift from the way we used to interact with bots, which we've been doing for a long time in these kinds of like customer interactions, from branching tree diagrams, where the programmer would have to decide in advance, these are the 5 things you can do, and then anticipate every possible interaction. And then when it fails, you go to a human, to now actually imposing guardrails. Like the bot can almost do too much. And so the designer has to say, well, like, go take it in this direction, not this other direction. And then the idea is that the human steps in if the customer gets kind of beyond the knowledge contained within the bot. Anyway, I would recommend looking at that. Other companies have been using it for like creating these kind of AI personas to evaluate data. Moody's, the investment evaluator company, they've been using it in that way. Johnson & Johnson has experimented with using some agents in product testing. All right, this is, I think, just way more interesting. What has DeepMind been up to? So DeepMind, in March of last year, announced this thing called SEMA, Scalable Indestructible Multi-World Agent, a generalist AI agent for three-dimensional virtual settings, And then here's what they say. This research marks the first time an agent has demonstrated it can understand a broad range of gaming worlds and follow natural language instructions to carry out tasks within them as a human might. This work isn't about achieving high game scores. Learning to play even one video game is a technical feat for an AI system, but learning to follow instructions in a variety of game settings could unlock more helpful AI agents for any environment. That's the sentence to underline, right? They want to build AI agents that operate in video game worlds in order to create models for AI agents that could operate in our world. This goes back to the robot, right? How do you actually get a robot that could navigate any kind of environment? Well, it's not just putting chips in a robot's fake head. It actually would be training robots to navigate simulated environments and then releasing them into environments that resemble the simulated environments. All right, so what does this actually look like? Well, let's keep going. The more interesting release was last year with this thing called Genie 2, a large-scale foundation world model. And the idea of Genie is let's create real-time computer-generated worlds. So rather than putting an AI agent into an existing video game, now you put the AI agent into a world that the computer system is creating and maintaining exactly to your specification. So you can say, I want to have a world that's filled with balloons, or I want to walk around in a house, and then I can plop Seema into that world and give Seema directions for how to navigate that world. So here's what they say. Genie 2 is a world model, meaning it can simulate virtual worlds, including the consequences of taking any action. It was trained on a large-scale video data set, and like other generative models, demonstrates various emergent capabilities at scale, such as object interactions, complex character animation, physics, and the ability to model and thus predict the behavior of other agents. Right, so it can interact with things in the world, and it can, in some sense, anticipate what these things are going to do, and then it can follow your directions. Let's go to the next slide. So here are two examples from the page, which I highly recommend after this presentation. You go look at this again. There's links in the file I shared with Kyle. So in one, they deposited a humanoid robot in ancient Egypt, and then you can watch as the robot takes directions from the user and moves in various directions. This is an entirely simulated world that has been called into being simply by the user's commands. Now, this is burning so much power, and it's so taxing on the system, they can only at this point get it to last for about 2 minutes. But you can easily see how this would translate back into taking a lot of video of an existing space, right? And then taking that video of the existing space and turning that into a computer representation, and then releasing your indestructible multi-world character into it, and then having it practice doing things in that space to then develop training that can be given back to a robot. And the example that really blew my mind in this was they generated a world that had these two buildings, one with a blue door and one with a red door, and they typed the command into the agent, opened the blue door and opened the red door, and the agent just walked right over, opened the door, and started walking around within the room. And that really is a kind of precursor, I think, of what DeepMind is up to, of trying to create simulations of worlds, practice running characters through those worlds, and then take that feedback mechanism into training physical robots. Still diffuse. It's still not quite the Terminator robot that we've imagined in days of yore, but it's moving closer to that kind of model. All right, now to close, before we have our question and answer time, I just wanted to read two thoughts that that have really resonated with me in thinking about like what do these recent developments mean. So the first one comes from Rogers, where he talks about those feeders and representatives. And I think this is really wise. These things are coming to our workplaces, I think, for some of us, whether we like it or not. But I think we're going to have to have conversations with our managers and our colleagues about right use and how these things might be forming us. So here's what he says about feeders. The issue with relying too much on this kind of AI agent is the slow burn of complacency. This is a guy writing for Wired, right? So he's rooting for technology here, digital technology. As more of the content I consume is fetched for me through personalized recommendation algorithms, I will likely make increasingly monotonous decisions, stumble upon fewer surprises. If I used an AI agent to compile my list of groceries every week and shop online through a delivery service, I'd enjoy the streamlined process at first, but probably would be less inclined through repetition to experiment with new dishes. And then what a great last sentence. Life becomes an exercise in creeping blandness. And then on representatives, I'd avoid these AI replicas at all cost, whether deploying one or interacting with one. The digital world has eclipsed the physical world in importance, and our lives are now largely mitigated through screens. Even if the tech is eventually good enough that sending an AI agent to FaceTime my grandma or letting it loose in the group chat to riff with my friends doesn't feel like a laughable idea, let's leave the automation to the dull tasks. We should show up as ourselves in online interactions. It's increasingly all we have left. And then one more. This was an article that my colleague Stephen Goforth, who has been really just doing yeoman's work gathering articles on AI. So his website's Stephen Goforth, Goforth Solutions. He posts materials about AI all the time. Anyway, he brought this article to my attention. I don't usually read Fast Company, that ran in December by a woman who works in giving. So she coordinates a number of people under her. And she just talks a little bit here about kind of her changing response to working with generative AI tools every day. So 2 slides and then I'm done. I use generative AI tools multiple times a day. As useful as these tools are for me, I find myself creaking under the volume of bullet point content that generative AI tools put out. The mind tax, that's her term, is highest in the areas where the cognitive work is highest and least repeatable, strategy development. If I ask generative AI a question about how best we should scale and improve our volunteer engagement strategy worldwide, it will list at least 8 bullet points. My first reaction is that of wonder and interest, and that these would be great to explore, pilot, and implement. In the early days of generative AI tools, I would share these bullet point lists of ideas with my team, and it would be met with similar reactions. Wow! And nothing would happen because the next step is a big and difficult one. It is to sift through complex and overabundant choices that were chiefly and swiftly generated. You don't value them because the energy and effort that went into generating them is not evident. And the real barrier is to design and implement the new pilots into the existing workflows, right? That we're facing the bottlenecks of lived existence, particularly within human communities. This requires interaction and buy-in from human beings and gathering of resources needed for the real action, which is a messy real-world stuff. And then she says at the end of this slide, I guess just one more, now when I get an AI or generative AI response, the dopamine spike in my brain is a bit more muted. And then the last one, the mind tax is a bit different. In the second chunk of work, I do fundraising and relationship building. Nonprofits and funders alike are using generative AI tools to develop proposals, requests for proposals, and project and impact reports. Multiple times daily, I find myself silently asking, did you really write this or did AI? Just like handwritten notes have decreased over time, human-generated content will also decrease over time. I have written about this. Got to think about the new verbal economy. But it will maintain its value because we hunger to be heard and cared for by another human. However, unlike handwritten notes, it will be harder to distinguish between AI-generated content and human-generated content. I don't think it will be practical to always disclose this content was developed in collaboration with an AI, right? That's the current strategy. At some point, AI is just word processing. Looking ahead, this part of our jobs may evolve to one where in-person meetings and program site visits reinforce trust in a way that online information exchange and analysis doesn't. Let's keep getting together.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you for that chilling presentation. I couldn't help thinking as you described, particularly the last couple pieces, that two things. One is, are we quickly advancing toward the fulfillment of the reductio ad machinam?
Ooh.
You can correct my Latin, Kyle.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think. Yeah, and agentic AI, the increasing hope in some quarters or fear in others of agency equipped or endowed AI. And I think of this in particularly terrifying immediate terms of a certain tech whiz seemingly given the keys to our government to uh, implement savings and efficiencies with what seems already to promises to be a human reduction in force and augmentation of already existing um, machine-based operatives or machine operatives. So it's not science fiction anymore.
No.
We are already there, and particularly when you take the principle of efficiency über alles, which is some political theorists would say is the core of neoliberal order, of the neoliberal order in which we exist. It's pretty terrifying. I don't think you have to exaggerate or fantasize much about that principle. So I guess one of the questions is, what are areas where human beings might want to stage resistance in development? Or is the logic always going to be, if we don't do this, because it's now a national security issue, of course, then they will, and they will leap ahead. And that principle will, as at least in the current environment, probably win the day.
Thanks for giving me an easy first question, man.
Yeah. well, maybe we could save that for later. Maybe just answer one part of it. Is there any sort of, are there areas of locations of effective challenging of the endowment of machines with certain properties, including agentic properties that will allow the machines, through chain of logical sequences, to assume agency, particularly in the running of things like our government.
Yeah. Okay. Hold on. I'm just jotting down a thought. Okay. So let's start with the reductio question. My concern of recent months, well, really my concern dating back a couple of years, but especially heightened in recent months, is actually the arrival of the boring apocalypse, where our media channels are flooded with machine generated content. So, okay, so someone just asked a question about this. So there's the Terminator apocalypse where the machines take over, Skynet launches, and the machines corral the control, or they assemble their own weapons, and they fight us for whatever purpose. Their purposes are probably inscrutable to us because they have super intelligence. And then the people have been talking about a boring apocalypse scenarios where generative AI specifically starts to infiltrate our more and more aspects of our lives. And it actually doesn't heighten our experiences. It just kind of adds another layer. I mean, to talk about the kind of hated, American hatred for bureaucracy, it's like adding another set of bureaucratic agents. And yeah, as Jay's saying, like it's efficient in some ways, but it's like kind of a flavorless efficiency. So like I have that concern that now these agentic technologies are going to be deployed, and rather than helping us to feel a kind of heightened agency in the philosophical sense, or the ability to act, right, to have a will and to realize it in some domain, maybe even exhibiting mastery, like that's humanity at its best, in my view. And I worry that the AI agents are just going to make us lazy. Like Reese's point, Reese Rogers' point in the second or third to last slide, the anti-penultimate slide that I shared, I thought really spoke well to this. That actually, like having your feeder constantly running, it actually might just be monotony. It might just be the repetition, and it will feed to your own slothfulness. So I worry about that, like kind of on the user side. Um, on the social side, my concern is that big tech, for their own purposes, is whispers or just start shouting or cajoling in the corridors of power and strives to make a world that's safe for AI agents. I really worry about that, right? So rather than having a world that's designed for the flourishing of human communities and individuals, we have a world that's safe for AI to operate, because the human world, what computer scientists talk about as the open world, is so complex, right? So machines struggle, like watching Mariner struggle with the Christmas cookie recipe. Grandma's recipe is hard right now for AI. So what do we need to do? Well, it'd be really nice if we could kind of narrow the options a little bit, or, maybe we should take human drivers off the streets so it's a little safer for automated vehicles, right? And human pilots, they're kind of risky. So I don't think we need humans to learn how to fly anymore. Or if they do, they're going to have a, really expensive insurance. So my concern is just that because of the positioning of big tech, we might have a reduction of human possibility. Um, and I don't know. I just always think about the kind of the double character of that word agent, right? That there's some people who use agents to talk about people that you deputize to do things for you, but there's this other group of people, especially philosophers, who talk about agency, being an agent, as being one who can realize your will. And I worry that we're going to get lots and lots of one, and we're going to get a diminishment of the other.
Well, according to one of our recent discussants on our evening discussion, Paul Schurz, we're already there, at least in the realm of medicine and science, biotechnical research, where you actually have machines algorithmically establishing research agendas.
Yeah.
And so there is an ongoing, can we call it a narrowification of human activities as dictated by algorithmic laws, rules, guidance. But
Jay,
there are a lot of
can I just
it's
have one thing
already
here?
yeah.
Very, very quickly, there is one possibility that I didn't talk about at all, but I also have thought a lot about, specifically in the context of my seminar, and the last slide was really speaking to this. It could be that we get tired of these AI agents, and that causes us to delight more in one another. Maybe, at least for some of us. Maybe your AI girlfriend isn't that satisfying.
We'll consult you on a regular basis with the question, are we tired yet?
Yes.
There are many questions. Kyle, would you?
Yeah, I'm going to take my prerogative to ask my own question real quick.
Okay, good.
And then we can take something in the chat. But I think my question has to do with how do we, as individuals and as groups, prepare to grapple with the kinds of questions that will enable us to either accept or reject these kinds of technologies. That's a real generic sort of way of framing the question, but let me just back up real quick and provide some context of my thinking about this. One is that you can think about the advances in AI as being kind of in the same box as a lot of other kinds of technological advancements in the last 200 years, and you can just call them disruptive technologies, right? Ones that advances in certain kinds of farming technologies completely destroyed certain ways of life, and some people rejected the use of some kinds of farming implements. Um, Most were unable to resist it because there were the imperatives of efficiency. In some cases, even something like national security.
Mhm.
National security and efficiency are the two sort of broad categories that really important imperatives that we as a country have used to sort of make sense about whether a technology should be adopted or not, right? Um, and so I guess the question is that I'm trying to get to is um, how do we prepare ourselves to ask the good questions that don't fall simply prey to the imperatives of efficiency and
Mhm.
technology. It seems like many of us are at this point are pretty ill-equipped to deal with those kinds of challenging questions. How, um, how do we do that? It's a big question.
Yeah. So I'm gonna go back to the seminar. The seminar, now this is obviously speaking to the privileged position I occupy as an academic and as someone on sabbatical. Um, uh, and that's not true for everyone. But I have discovered in the seminar the benefits of bringing together people who are like-minded enough that they want to speak, but who are of independent enough of mind that they can offer distinct perspectives and challenge one another in the goal of mutual understanding. So, I've got people who are in the sciences and social sciences in the seminar. I've got people who are on the humanities side. I've got a philosopher. I've got a theologian, right? I've got a political philosopher, and people don't all see what's happening the same way. And there's some who are cheerleading with reservations, and there are others who really want to be the resistance, but they grasp that they cannot be the resistance well unless they understand what these technologies are and what the actual state of their capabilities is, as well as like what's the project of big tech? Like
Yeah.
where are the key researchers even trying to go? Um, we had a presentation recently by my friend Brian McGraw, who has a really good book out right now that you should all check out. Brian McGraw with some co-authors. You can go look that up. But Brian raised the question of the alignment problem, right? Which is like how do the traditionally framed as like how do the desires of the creator latch onto or oppose those of the actual creation in these tech conversations. So like, what is the designer trying to do? What does the AI want to do? And I realized in the context of that conversation that like there's many alignment problems and not all of them are necessarily bad. But I think the problem for the individual user is, gosh, like you read these headlines every day and you feel this kind of flurry of activity. So what we need is more settings like the one we're in right now. Like we need to have opportunities to get together with people who are not or like close enough to us that we want to talk to them, but different enough from us that they will show us like, yes, that is really scary, Kyle. And like, no, like it's not quite as bad as it seems. And actually that's really useful. And it's useful in this way, but there's this other way in which it's really harmful and you absolutely should not buy that thing. And if the University of Virginia adopts it, you should not use it. And you should write to, the president's office immediately to say, stop it. And like I've also had some really great conversations with AIT folks at my own institution, and like their way of looking at it is different than the way that the humanities professors in particular. And I think both sides are going to be willing to make some concessions. Now, like if you
Yeah,
do,
but
yeah, can I just say one more thing?
as one of the audience, Rose Chernkovich asks everyone, the prospects are clearly tragic for humanity. Who's in charge? Who's in charge here? Is this something even remotely sort of within the purview of democratic government and choice? Or I mean, who makes this decision about whether the tech people are right on moving forward with this technology, or do we listen to the theologians and the philosophers and the humanists, or
Yeah. Well, so someone like me, like I'm
I
forced to
mean,
listen to the theologians and the
shouldn't at
humanists.
least the question be asked? Who should be deciding about this?
Yeah, so if I could, let me say two things on this question of like, again, this kind of resistance and who's in control. I think we're still at a moment where users get to decide. I mean, so because I've been following this story really closely for the last couple of years, I noticed that there was a period in 2021 and particularly 2022 after ChatGPT's debut when every single major business in America advertised that they were working on AI, right? Everybody was in AI. And what was really happening was any corporation that was doing anything that kind of sounded like machine learning was suddenly an AI company. But the actual corporate adoption of these tools has been pretty slow. And that means that big tech is really running on a deficit. These things are not yet money makers, and DeepSeek's arrival actually threatens the business model, or could threaten the business model of American big tech. So, like, the position of our tech overlords on this one, I think, is a little bit more fragile than the news reports suggest. So it could be that this is not exactly much ado about nothing, because there's still like ground level spiritual questions about and psychological questions about what it means to be interacting with bots so much. But whether our tech overlords are going to get to continue to rule on this, I think, is still something of a question of like, is this like cost effective? Like, are people willing to buy into it if it's expensive? Because we're all getting it for free right now because Microsoft and Google are giving DeepMind and OpenAI free compute. That's the terms of the arrangement. But once it becomes a question of like, will the University of Virginia pay thousands of dollars of subscriber fees for Jay Tolson and Kyle Williams to have Mariner or Operator, then I think the whole debate is going to change. And I think also the space at the ground floor level, like, we're still integrating these things into the local workflows of businesses, and it could be that they're just not that good. The products actually aren't as effective as they seem. And this gets back to the headspace problem that I began with, like that our imaginations are always going to run several steps ahead of what the products actually do. So I think I see these things as scary, but I also am not quite sure that they're scary in the way they're going to be scary in the way that I imagine.
Now, I think it is scary when the human imagination is being stunted on a daily basis. When you have U.S. government agencies having all of their subscriptions to publications canceled.
Yes.
So presumably now people will get all of their information through various technologically located media and selected media. That's a very scary prospect. But there are many excellent questions. Kyle,
there's a good question here from Traver Carlson, who asks, making the world safe for AI involves the reduction of complexity in the material and social world, which Rogers observes in his own behavior, such that he experiences fewer surprises. If education continues to rely on an openness to surprise as the event of learning, I think that's a big if, but something, an interesting way of describing it. If education continues to rely on an openness to surprise as the event of learning, are education and the usage of AI systems necessarily oppositional? In brief, must educators who aim toward agency adopt a technophobic position?
Yeah. So just because I just looked at this and I meant to mention this earlier, let me just show you Olson's book. This really is great. So those of you who are listening in, if you want to understand where DeepMind and OpenAI come from, you should get this book. It's not so great on the actual technical details of how transformers work. You can look elsewhere for that. I've offered you some resources today. But Parmi Olson's book, Supremacy, is really great in understanding, like, where did this come from? In the case of OpenAI, it was the attempt to, create universal abundance. And so to have machines take over all of the parts of our lives that we don't want to have, and then everyone gets rich together and we're all happy. And then in the case of DeepMind, my summary of Olson on this one is using video games to probe the mind of Spinoza's God. Which is like, they really believe that video games are a way of knowing, a kind of epistemology, and that shows up in what I was saying about SEMA. On the education side, I have my own thoughts, which it would take much longer to relate, but I'm not sure that we have to be exclusively technophobic. but I am concerned about maintaining healthy epistemic ecologies, right? That as students move around our campuses, they experience diverse ways of knowing and encountering the world, because I do have a kind of deep commitment to a view of the world as open, right? That the world is constantly throwing at us this variety of sensory and intellectual experiences, which we can only take in to a small extent at any given time, but which is a rich abundance. And I think the disciplines, if they're functioning properly, testify to that abundance. And I can identify the hubris of any one discipline that wants to claim total knowledge over it all. Um, so within the discipline's various projects, AI, I think will appear, in some cases problematic, in other cases as really useful. Particularly, scientists are already finding lots of useful ways to implement generative AI in education, although they also don't want to put themselves out of business, and I think are quite willing to address the limitations, and will be louder about that in the next couple of years. On the other side, I think it's important to leave space for the resistance, for the philosophy professor who says, I believe that this is inherently evil, detrimental to the character of human agency. And I, for one, want my students to be exposed to both sides, right? That AI may actually be useful to supplementing the project of scientific inquiry, but that the detractors have reasons for taking the positions that they do. So, I mean, that's, I also think courtesy is good.
One person in our audience is already saying that the answer to that question of who's going to decide, the
Okay.
answer is the high priests of cyber world who have the power and wealth to call the shots. That's Andy Reynolds. I'm boosting his
Yeah,
answer because I know
good.
him, and he's been he's had a lot of experience with
Yeah.
these sorts of
Hey,
questions. And he also links to a talk that that I think Musk gave at West Point,
Good.
which is an interesting. And he
That's good.
includes a link. Um, I believe he does. I think it's in there somewhere.
hey,
Looking.
hey, Rick, can I ask you a question about this rhetoric about utopia and apocalypticism?
Yeah.
I saw the CEO of Anthropic a few weeks ago saying that
Oh, yeah.
we're a few years away from basically doubling the human lifespan, which is exciting, I guess,
Yeah.
if that were the case. Seems like, but then there's plenty of other CEOs, and maybe the same CEO saying that we're a few years away from perhaps the end of the world. Um, d Two questions. Do you think that they really believe we're on the edge of a kind of singularity of advanced man and technology, super intelligence, that kind of thing? Or is there something cynical about these kind of pronouncements about either utopia or apocalypticism? And if it's cynical, then what do they gain from it?
Yeah. So, let me just say first, doubling the human lifespan sounds good until you think about the Tithonus syndrome, right? Like, is my neuronal architecture going to continue to be spry, and my arteries clear when I am 200 years old?
That's a
So
good question.
you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
it could be that like a satisfying 100-year campaign might be sufficient. Like some of us would be happy to live to 50, like whatever. So on the question of doom speak, I have to admit, like when I first started reading these stories back in 2019. So my backstory is that I got really interested in the digital humanities shortly after I took my position at Wheaton, partly because of the fact that there were no obvious classes for me to teach at the upper division level. So I had to kind of teach myself something new, and I'd been intrigued by what I was hearing about DH while I was in grad school. And I just fell in love with text generators, which is a very strange thing to say, especially now that text generators can love you back. Um, but I found the old artistic project and to some extent technical project of text generation really fascinating. But with the arrival of GPT-2, there was definitely an uptick of the doom scenarios happening from within the development community. And I think some people mean it. I think some people have like deeply formed imaginations that have been deeply formed by science fiction. And so they really are anxious about the possibility of the alignment problem erupting in a kind of disjunction between computers with superintelligence and human ability. So, like, I think some of them really believe it. I think that someone like Sam Altman or the Anthropic head or even some of the stuff coming out of Google, like I think it's about it getting attention. Um, and
Yeah.
so I really like your example that like one day it's about how the human lifespan's about to double, and then the next day it's about how we're doomed.
Yeah.
And then the reward is we get to hear about Anthropic in the news. And I don't know. I think it's self-serving. And there was a really if you read the AI snake oil piece that I linked to, so I brought it up in the piece, but if you keep reading, one of the things one of the observations they make uh, is that the tech leaders are no better at predicting things than anybody else. There's no reason to believe that they would be better. And I don't know if you all have noticed this, but like whenever these things are discussed in the news, it's always 2 to 5 years. Yeah, 2 to 5 years. Why?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's just, like, these
Well,
are totally arbitrary
that
numbers.
was the Marvin Minsky prediction. Right?
Totally.
Every 10 years, he would say we'd arrive at the singularity in 10 years, and it kept extending. I think it still extends. We have an actual hand raised, Jackson Lears. Um, uh, Jackson, it's good to have a historian here
I
thinking
now
about
have permission to unmute. Thank you,
We've
sir.
got a tight rein here, Jackson.
I can tell that. I appreciate that, Keith. Uh, I'm so struck. Well, I think this is a fascinating conversation, if also chilling, as Jay suggested. And I want to thank you, Rick, for the presentation. But I'm so struck. I hope I'm not repeating what's already been said. It seems like we've been skirting around this a good deal. There's a kind of dematerialization that is a kind of core impulse in a great deal of technological development, increasing isolation of the individual from engagement with the material world,
Yeah.
often and the biological world as well as the social world. So it's a kind of etherealization of everything, and it's always presented, or it has always been presented over the past several hundred years as labor saving or reducing drudgery, reducing mere routine tasks, and in order to free us up for presumably more exalted tasks. And actually, I've been rereading Moby Dick
Mm,
lately, uh, and I really am rereading it. I have read it before, unlike many
mm,
the usual academic reflexes to say, "Oh yes, I was just rereading Nietzsche the other day," but in any case, I have, and I'm struck by what there's a wonderful chapter, and it it precedes the famous scene on the quarterdeck where Ahab nails the Spanish doubloon to the mast and challenges anyone to. He says he'll give it to anyone who will
mm,
be the first to cite Moby Dick.
mm,
But then he goes on to say, all visible things are as pasteboard
mm,
mask. And I
mm,
want to strike. We must strike through the mask. Uh, we are imprisoned and behind this wall
mm,
of perception. We have to, and we don't know what's on the other side. There may be naught for all I care. There may be nothing behind that wall, nothingness. Uh, but he has this impulse to break through it, and it
mm,
seems to me that there is this is a kind of impulse that has taken root and flowered, if I can use an
mm,
inappropriate organic metaphor, in our
mm,
culture. It has been rooted there for a long time, but it's it there are so many sort of offhand comments I can make about,
mm,
and I don't want to be making derisive comments about a whole class of people who might be considered autistic, because there are all different kinds of
Mm,
autistic people.
mm,
But it does strike me that this is a world that we are being prepared for, a world where we are isolated not just from material things, from the material experience of drudgery or of writing thank you notes,
mm,
that that autistic people would just prefer not to deal with. And
mm,
those kinds of people are being rewarded
mm,
for personality traits that are considered pathological in other contexts. And
mm,
it's so the comment about that Jay read about the the high priests of technology, there is that kind of dematerial quality, but also very isolated from ordinary human experience.
mm,
Late, it's what, and I find myself going back to Ruskin and Morris and the
mm,
recognition that look, uh, labor saving devices are fine, but life is a good deal of labor is
mm,
routine or is repetitive or is drudgery. It's finding one's not escaping that altogether to some ethereal realm, but in fact immersing oneself and finding
mm,
meaning through that and beyond that drudgery somehow without escaping it altogether. So there's another passage in Melville leading up to the Ahab scene that I was mentioning, where he's talking about Ishmael. The narrator is talking about young men like himself, given to metaphysical
mm,
speculation, uh, who often sign on to whaling ships, and they're terrible at
mm,
whaling because they're up in the
mm,
crow's nest and they're staring down at
mm,
the bottomless deep, thinking of infinity, thinking of their pantheistic yearnings
mm,
are looking for the oversoul or looking for the ultimate meaning behind the mask of nature, the pasteboard mask of nature. So in a sense, they're like miniature Ahabs, even if they're
mm,
benign and transcendental about it. Uh, and the old salts on the ship, who of course are immersed in the material culture of whaling and knowing how to do things with their hands, up to and including flinging a harpoon,
mm,
which has always struck me as
mm,
a rather challenging feat. Uh, they're constantly riding these kids. They say, young man, we've been out here, we've been at sea for months, and you haven't sighted a single whale.
mm,
What are you looking at up there? And Melville basically concludes by saying, well, they're looking down at the deep ocean, and they might get so distracted they'll just fall off the crow's nest and drown. Um, so take heed, ye pantheists, take heed. And it's like this, the lords of high tech are not pantheists by any
mm,
means, but there is this dissatisfaction with everyday life, everyday social interactions,
mm,
the everyday material world that seems to be animating a good deal of this. And most people are not obsessed by these
mm,
kinds of yearnings, it seems to me, to transcend or escape the material world altogether. I could give other examples
mm.
from with respect to biology, but we can uh, back burner those. But does this strike you as an apt description of a lot of the high tech gurus that you've been citing who are looking forward to this uh, post biological, post material world, or and is there a way to reassert the? I mean, the nature is going to go on reasserting itself
They will.
regardless of what people say. We learned that during the postmodern era when, everyone was talking about the cultural construction of nature without realizing that culture was also naturally constructed. And it So there was this tendency to want to dismiss biology and nature, even as um, and one is trying constantly trying to penetrate it and transcend it. Forgive my rant, my rambling here, but it's a series of associations that you
Yeah.
awakened in me.
Tolson, can I respond? Got time?
Yes, by
Okay.
all means. Yeah.
So first of all, you're a legend. Thanks for listening in. I thought that was terrific. And what you're demonstrating for us is the in some sense the activity that I think is the proper response to big tech becoming accidental philosophy labs. Is
Yes.
that like the response I think should be to philosophize back and getting down to core commitments seems to me like the right territory to go. So I love the language of dematerialization. I think it's spot on. And we don't have to look far. So Hans Merriweck very famously has this scenario that was, well, I don't know when he first launched it, 70s or 80s, about sort of slowly slicing your brain in pieces and then creating the digital resemblance of it so you can escape your body. Like that Gnostic strain is super strong. Ray Kurzweil has the same idea, right? Kurzweil is trying to survive. Right? You take an extremely healthy lifestyle, exercise every day, take lots of supplements so that he can live to the singularity, so that he can be downloaded. Kurzweil is not like some fringy guy. I mean, he's like
No, not
a
at all.
central figure in the history of the development of computer science, and particularly the like applied computer science in the late 20th century, and has held appointments at numerous Silicon Valley outfits. So that the dematerialization language is terrific. And I like the way that you're in some sense extending it from the kind of Kurzweilian eschatology to just saying like, gosh, aren't all these agents just making us like pretend, like, is speaking to this impulse to disembody ourselves? And then actually my concern is that life actually will be even less satisfying once you do. So two more, or maybe three more thoughts. Secondly, I just also coming at this as a humanist, I appreciate your point about historical chauvinism, right? That we are not living in the only golden age that has ever existed, if we're even living in one. And I too look to the past to find out about how people experience the world. To use a language I learned from Walter Ong, past periods have different sensoria, right? That their actual physical sensory experience of the world is different than ours. And I think the great authors of the past bring us into rival experiences of the open world, and in that way are nourishing and point to alternatives, right? So when our world feels dry, I can pick up, to cite another book that I'm reading right now with my 8-year-old son, Treasure Island.
Oh yeah.
He's not ready for Moby Dick, but like
Yeah.
Treasure Island is just like it's so delightful, but like it has all of these sensory stimuli that's coming out of Stevenson's experience moving around the world, and like you can like the sea is something that my children barely know, but like it was part of my childhood, going to the Long Island Sound and just
Yes.
sucking in that salty air. So I also like the point you're making of old books can still speak to us, and maybe will do so urgently in certain dimensions now that we're offered a kind of denuded digital experience, that as AI agents do more and more for us and our experience becomes potentially even more bland, someone picking up Moby Dick might find something there
Yeah.
that an earlier generation wouldn't have even noticed was there. There's flavor. Then third point, I have two more. Third point, I'm all for embodied cognition. So I also think we think with our bodies, we are embodied creatures. Knowing is something that happens all around our creatures. So it actually could be that people who work almost exclusively or who are trained, their educations are permeated by AI, and then they go off to college and they fake their way through college using AI, and then they're working in AI workplaces that are filled with AI agents. They actually just might not be very interesting thinkers.
Right. Yeah.
They also might not get much exercise. So I, and I think like, again, speaking of my own experience, like there is a certain kind of thinking that happens when your body is doing a repetitive task. So I
Right.
often have really good thoughts when I'm doing the dishes.
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
it's very easy to imagine how you could make in fact, this is in development, a dish cleaning robot, right? The robot that cleans your dishes, the robot that cooks your eggs, the robot that folds your laundry. Yes, it is drudgery. Yes, it was wrong for us to assign half of our species the exclusive responsibility of this for hundreds of years, but actually folding the laundry kind of frees up your mind in other ways. So I'm all for embodied cognition and embracing at least some degree of drudgery. And then lastly, I should have said this earlier in response to Kyle. I think we all need to realize that the models need us, that our outputs are necessary. This is my new verbal economy argument that I made last summer. The models depend on us for their continued relevance.
Right.
That's why I wanted to stress the hidden human labor, that there's all like the product that gets advertised is a glistening digital interface. But the actual product development, once you understand the training procedures, involves all of these humans. Some of them are high-tech wizards. Some of them are math teachers who are writing problems to middle school. They're writing new middle school math problems. They're writing out the solutions, and then those things get fed in. There's companies that now exist as middlemen to enlist human experts to be the guide to the machine. So it's more bound up in us than I think we want to realize. And I think if you want to be a part of the resistance, you can just choose to stop playing. There might be financial costs for some people, but it's the same thing with social media. If you don't like social media, the immediate solution should be drop your accounts.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Rick, I think we could rejoin and say, if you stop playing, you may end up being played. But that would be too harsh a judgment. This has really been a fascinating discussion, and I want to thank you for going beyond our hour by more than a half an hour. And but I recommend to everyone that if they did not have a chance to read any of the pieces we listed in the announcement, his language machinery piece, as well as the new verbal economy and autocomplete, and many others. If you go to our website, hedgehogreview.com, you will see that and go to the search line, you will find many pieces by Rick dealing with such issues as these, but also completely other ones. I mean, reflections on Adam Smith, a series of critical miniatures looking at sort of different aspects of literary works, including their prologues, their titles, short works. It's a really marvelous sort of collection of miniatures, critical miniatures that he did in a series for us. And when I say he's a wide-ranging person, don't take my word. Go look at the evidence. It was really a greatly illuminating talk, Rick, and the many contributors today. And there are more who are on the chat list. And Rick, we will send you those. If you would like to Rick, can I give people your contact, or would you give
Yes, just know
Yes.
I'm on sabbatical and I have a book manuscript that's due in 2 weeks. So I'm not going to be very active with email in the next 2
Then
weeks.
I will
So
not. Yeah, I will.
if you liked it so much that you still want to email me or get a response in 2 weeks, fantastic. But if you write to me today, I'm not writing back, and tomorrow's Valentine's Day. And as much as I love you people, I love my wife more.
Fair enough. Again, thank you, Rick.
Thanks.
It was a pleasure. Goodbye, all.